All right, let's just jump right in. For generations, the story of ancient India has been treated like a settled fact, something you'd find in a textbook, case closed. But what if that story, the one we all learned, is off by not just a couple hundred years, but by more than 10,000 years? Today, we're going to explore a completely different version of history, one that isn't based on old colonial ideas, but on hard data from our own genes, from the stars, and from the Earth itself.
So this should look pretty familiar, right? This is the story most of us got in school. Sometime around 1500 BCE, these nomadic warriors called Aryans supposedly came charging into India and brought down the great Harappan civilization. And then what? Well, we're told there was this long dark age, and it wasn't until 1,000 years later, when the Greeks showed up, that civilization finally got going again. This is the official timeline we've been handed down.
So the official story ties a neat little bow on it. Indian civilization is about 3,500 years old. That's the number that's been hammered into our heads for decades. But what if it's not just a little bit off? What if it's completely, fundamentally wrong? Yeah, what if that number is just not the real story? What if we could rewind the clock way past that supposed invasion, past the pyramids of Egypt, and deep into the world right after the last ice age? You know, there's evidence in ancient texts suggesting a civilization was tracking the stars with incredible accuracy at least 10,000 years ago. And what if we push it even further back? What does our own DNA have to say about it? Well, the genetic record tells a story of an indigenous population that goes back over 24,000 years. Now, this isn't just a wild guess. This is a timeline being pieced together by modern, evidence-based science. So the big question is, how on earth do we square these two totally different stories? And that right there, that's the heart of what we're talking about today. It's this clash between an enforced narrative, a story we inherited from colonial-era thinking, and a brand new evidence-based narrative that's popping up from all these different scientific fields. One story is based on theories about language from the 1800s. The other is built on data we can actually check and verify right now. We're just going to follow the evidence. As Dr. Raj Vedam, who's a key researcher in this area, says, the whole point is to build a history based on evidence. It's about letting the data tell the story, whether that data comes from our genes, the stars, or the grounds beneath our feet. So let's take a look at that data. So how do we even begin to test a wild timeline like 24,000 years? Well, we're going to look at 3 separate scientific clocks. First up is the biological clock, the story that's written in our DNA. Then we're going to turn to the celestial clock, using the movement of the stars to date ancient stories. And finally, we'll check the Earth clock, which tells us the geological history of the land itself. Let's see what they have to say. Okay, let's start with the evidence that's closest to home, our own genetic code. The whole Aryan Invasion theory really hinges on this idea of a massive group of foreigners moving into India around 1500 BCE. So the question is simple. Is there any record of that huge event in our DNA? And this is where that old story really starts to crumble. For decades, we've heard about this big genetic divide between so-called Aryans in the north and Dravidians in the south. But when geneticists actually look at the DNA, that divide just isn't there. We are all genetically one big, ancient, thoroughly mixed family. And what's really crucial is that there's just no genetic fingerprint of a massive foreign invasion around 1500 BC. Instead, the evidence points to a deep indigenous ancestry right there on the subcontinent that goes back at least 24,000 years. Okay, so let's move on to our second clock, the celestial clock, and see how this builds the case. If people were here for all those millennia, what were they up to? Well, for one thing, they were looking up. The ancient Indian texts, especially the Vedas, are absolutely packed with super precise astronomical observations. And thanks to modern software, we can actually use those observations like a time machine to date the texts. The field is called archaeoastronomy. And here's the cool part. Because we know the stars move in these really slow, predictable cycles, like the 26,000-year wobble of the Earth's axis, we can basically run the sky backwards in a computer. So if an ancient text describes a really specific alignment of stars, we can calculate the exact date that alignment happened. So let's take a specific, testable example, right? There's this really strange story in the Rig Veda about some divine twins called the Ashwins, and it involves the sun, Surya, suddenly becoming almost unbearably bright. Now, for ages, everyone just chalked it up to being a myth. But what if it wasn't a myth? What if it was the memory of a real-life astronomical event? And this
This is where it gets absolutely incredible. Using the star positions mentioned in the text, archaeoastronomers dated this myth to around 7200 BCE. Now, fast forward to 2022. Scientists are analyzing ice cores from Greenland, and they find chemical evidence of a gigantic, once in 10,000 years solar flare. And their date for that event? 7176 BCE. The timelines are a near-perfect match. What we once dismissed as a simple story now looks like the only human record of a real, scientifically proven solar storm that happened over 9,000 years ago. Just let that sink in for a second.
So for our final clock, we're coming back down to Earth, because these ancient texts aren't just full of stars, they're also full of really detailed descriptions of the land. So can geology and marine archaeology actually verify these descriptions, and by doing that, help us test this ancient timeline? The ancient texts talk constantly about this mighty river, the Saraswati, calling it the greatest river of them all. But here's the problem. Geological evidence from satellite imagery shows that this river completely dried up around 1900 BCE. So how could the people who wrote the Rig Veda, who supposedly only showed up after 1500 BCE, write about this river with such detail? It doesn't make any sense. And it's not just that. Off the coast of Gujarat, marine archaeologists have found the sunken ruins of a huge ancient city, right where the epic Mahabharata says the city of Dwarka was swallowed by the sea. It seems the Earth itself is telling us a much older story. So the evidence from all three of our clocks, our genes, the stars, and the Earth, they all point to a much, much older and continuous civilization. But, redating history like this opens up an even deeper question. If this civilization was so advanced for so long, what did they know? It turns out their entire approach to knowledge, to science itself, was fundamentally different from ours. And that might be the biggest discovery of all. Okay, so at the heart of it is this huge difference in how you approach reality. Modern science is totally built on being objective. It studies the known, the physical world of matter and energy, by trying to take the observer, the scientist, out of the picture. But Vedic science, or Vijnana, has a much more holistic view. It says you can't have complete knowledge unless you understand all three parts of the equation. The knower, that's you, your consciousness. The known, the universe out there. And the process of knowing that connects the two. It's a science that actually includes the scientist. Here's a really powerful way to picture it. On one side, you have modern science trying to understand reality by building giant machines like the particle collider at CERN to smash the known, to break matter into smaller and smaller pieces to see what it's made of. On the other side, you have Vedic science, which explores reality using technologies of consciousness, like meditation, to directly experience the knower, that fundamental field of awareness that reality itself comes from. One looks out, the other looks in. Now, here's the part that's truly mind-bending. For the last 100 years or so, modern physics has been on this quest to find a unified field, a single source of all the forces and particles in the universe. Well, according to Vedic science, the ancient rishis, the ancient seers, didn't just identify this field thousands of years ago, they had a technology to experience it directly. And they called it Brahman, or just pure consciousness. Think of all of knowledge like a giant tree. Modern science has gotten incredibly good at studying all the leaves and all the branches, the different expressions of natural law, like gravity, electromagnetism, chemistry, quantum mechanics. Each field of science is its own separate branch. Vedic science, on the other hand, is all about watering the root of the tree. It says that if you can understand and directly experience the single unified source of everything, consciousness, the unified field, then you understand where all the leaves and branches, all those laws of nature, come from. It's a science of unity, not just the science of parts. So, what does this all add up to? When we put all this historical evidence together with this completely different philosophy of science, we end up at a pretty amazing conclusion. This isn't just about arguing over a date on a timeline. The evidence is suggesting that we aren't just reclaiming thousands of years of lost history. We are potentially reclaiming a whole different kind of science, a more complete method of investigation that doesn't build a wall between the outside world of matter and the inside world of consciousness, but sees them both as flowing from a single unified reality. And so that's the thought I want to leave you with. Our modern world is an incredible testament to the power of objective science, no doubt about it. But if there was once a science that didn't separate us from the cosmos, but saw us as a fundamental part of it, what have we forgotten?
What essential piece of wisdom about who we are and our real place in the universe have we lost along the way?